Is Jana Hunter-Bowman, a graduate and advisory board member, and the steering committee members for this conference. And again, we're so happy to have you here. This afternoon, we're going to be moving into, for our first set of speakers, thinking about the arts. A part of what we're working to do here is to have an expansive view of peace building and to understand what that entails. And especially since Jean-Paul Lederach's moral imagination, peace-building scholars and practitioners recognize that movement towards peace requires more than cognitive, rational engagement. We understand that conflict and desperation and aspiration require modes of expression that defy words. Justin and Brooke Roth-Shank have demonstrated through the years that cultural work and the arts offer resources for restoring and transforming communities and fostering the capacities required for peace, such as receptivity, creativity, compassion, and the ability to embrace paradox. Over the past 15 years, they've pursued a studio practice that emphasizes social justice, peace-building, gratitude, and intention. Together, they have a collective background in teaching community art, community organizing, historic preservation, and community development, all of which has fueled a belief that beauty plays a vital role in a community and a world that is moving towards health and wholeness. Brooke has illustrated 3 children's books dedicated to peace building and cultural understanding, and has another one of her own individual paintings. Justin has designed and produces 2 lines of functional pottery decorated with custom-made ceramic decals. One with a poppy motif symbolizes opposition to violent conflict, and one highlights historic and contemporary political figures. Justin's also published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals and is coming out with his own book. Together, Brooke and Justin have collaborated on several noteworthy exhibitions. In a 2015 exhibition titled Instruments of Peace at Bluffton University, Brooke painted 25 objects that inspired peace and 25 portraits of peacemakers. Justin made 25 corresponding mugs featuring them. A follow-up exhibition of 2016 titled No Justice at the Farron Contemporary Gallery on the campus of Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art was focused on paintings and pottery featuring political figures in the US Supreme Court. This monumental exhibition also included a 190-piece dinnerware set featuring all 44 presidents. The High Museum of Art in Atlanta then commissioned pottery pieces for its permanent collection that incorporated images from the Civil Rights Photography Archive. Their work is a part of other museum collections as well, including the Frick Museum in Pittsburgh, the San Angelo Museum of Art in San Angelo. Brooke and Justin have both received a variety of grants as important recognitions of their work. They have 3 young children and work from their home studio in Goshen, Indiana. I'm so pleased that they're with us to share with us their unusual ability to contribute to health and wholeness and peace building on multiple levels. So, Brooke and Justin. And maybe we should say, as people are coming in, please come on in and have a seat.
Thank you for welcoming us, Jana, and for making space at the table for the visual arts and the conversation about peace building. When we decided to pursue full-time work as studio artists, we wrote a mission statement to help guide our work and our family life. And several times each year we revisit this to help stay on track.
Here's what we wrote. We believe that artwork and creativity are a catalyst for social change and economic improvement. We understand that creating beauty is integral to our human experience and offers an invitation to order, coherence, and unity. Art is an inclusive form of communication reaching across class, education, and ethnic boundaries. It enables self-understanding, provides a window into other cultures, and gives a context to history and education. Hang on a second. I'm not sure if the slides are moving forward.
Oops.
Sorry about that.
I think we're at the end.
Maybe we'll just proceed without the slides, because it's at the very end.
Oop.
There we go. Sorry about that.
I'll continue with what we wrote.
Yeah.
We commit to respect and cherish our environment, seek and promote nonviolent means of reconciliation, share our resources and gift our time, pursue new ways of learning and be open to change, and to participate in a faith community.
Artists, broadly speaking, are the culture makers of society. Ancient potsherds and cave paintings are how we have learned about the earliest civilizations. Paintings, sculptures, and architecture are what identify societies from all eras of human existence. Contemporary artists define marketing strategies, landscapes, and clothing that we interact with daily. The ability to express complex or contradictory information without words makes space for everyone to participate in the conversation and reduces the potential of alienating each other through misunderstood language. We, Brooke and I, often struggle to understand this role, and we wrestle with our responsibility to talk about, promote, and examine peace building in the work that we do.
We're going to share some stories of our own experiences using art as peace builders. We've approached this work often feeling unqualified, with open minds about how an intuitive practice of learning and doing can impact the world around us. Our stories focus on three themes: building a diverse community network through hard work and relationship, persistence and dedication to a daily practice, and setting goals and working with intention to achieve them.
In 2001, after graduating Goshen College and shortly after moving to Pittsburgh for an apprenticeship with a cabinet maker, I helped to start a nonprofit community arts organization with 10 other young people interested in the arts, faith, and community development. We were inspired by a vacant, dilapidated, 15,000 square foot, 100-year-old Gothic stone church building. It was slated for demolition. The church was in a racially diverse neighborhood on Pittsburgh's East End. The crumbling building represented the challenge of how to redevelop a city in an inclusive manner and simultaneously honor its complex history. Almost everything in the building was falling apart, including more than 100 broken, missing, and worn-out stained glass windows. In short, it was a real gem of a building, perfect for our young ambitions. In my role as co-founder and the first employee of the Union Project, one of my responsibilities was orchestrating a volunteer-driven restoration of this historic building. Having grown up in Goshen with models like Habitat for Humanity, Mennonite Disaster Service, and Help a House, this project, perhaps naively, seemed manageable. Over the next several years, I organized more than 20,000 hours of volunteer labor to methodically dismantle the crumbling interior of the building in preparation for a $1.5 million interior renovation. A big problem remained. There were still more than 100 stained glass windows to fix, and we couldn't do any new interior work until the windows were repaired. We got estimates from stained glass restoration contractors of $1 million just for the window repairs. This was money we didn't have. So, using the volunteer workforce that was already in place, combined with a knowledge of craft school teaching models, we sought out a stained glass artist who would be willing to teach a stained glass restoration class to novice, unskilled community members, using our windows as the class materials. Old homes and churches in Pittsburgh are filled with stained glass windows. Many neighborhood participants expressed an interest in learning stained glass repair so they could fix their own windows. It was my job to organize materials, oversee the removal of old windows, and the reinstallation of newly repaired windows, and to advertise and recruit students who would pay for these classes. We advertised our very first class in 2004, wondering if anyone would be interested and if this idea had any merit. The first class was so popular, we immediately offered a second, concurrent class, which also filled immediately. 8 weeks after that, we offered 2 more. A year later, we had restored enough of the worst windows to enable interior renovations on half of the building. More importantly, we had demonstrated to the local community a concrete method of connecting people with place through shared work. And by charging class fees, we saved hundreds of thousands of dollars. This stained glass restoration model acted as leverage for our young organization to continue raising funds to restore the church building for community use. We continued this stained glass model off and on for 7 years through several different phases of renovations. Eventually, we restored every window in the building with the class model and also restored both the interior and exterior of the church for long-term use as a community art center. This restoration project has served as a model for community-driven historic preservation and creative problem-solving around the city and state. The Union Project organization continues today with a vision that states, through the arts, everyone is able to transform their lives and communities. Now, nearly 20 years after seeing the old abandoned church building, dozens of other folks and I, all who supported this project through donations and hands-on restoration, can drive past the Union Project in Pittsburgh and say, that's my stained glass window. Through practical, step-by-step driven, craft-driven enterprise, we created value where there wasn't any. Instead of ripping down a crumbling neighborhood landmark to replace it with a Dollar Tree, we built community and community investment by making a historic structure beautiful again. And that beauty matters. Irish author, poet, priest, and philosopher John O'Donohue wrote in his book Beauty, "Constant struggle leaves us tired and empty. Our struggle for reform needs to be tempered and balanced with a capacity for celebration. When we lose sight of beauty, our struggle becomes tired and functional. When we expect and engage the beautiful, a new fluency is set free with us and between us. The heart becomes rekindled and our lives brighten with unexpected courage."
You can see the windows from the church now.
We're having trouble with the slides, so we'll just
sorry about that.
Leave those and keep telling our story.
After almost 10 years in Pittsburgh, we had our first child and moved to a rural home east of Goshen to pursue work as studio artists and to learn more about what it means to embrace a dedicated creative practice. By 2014, we were the parents of 2 small boys, and my days were full of the constant tasks that accompany parenting and home life. I had only a little time to paint, but it was an activity that gave me fresh energy to be present with my family. As a result, I fully embraced the value of a daily practice, more from a basic need to make space for creating than from the later understanding that doing something I loved every day was the one way I could be dedicated to a personal practice. I decided to complete a daily painting of an image not larger than 1 by 1 inch each day for a year. This daily painting exercise was a path to creative persistence during a time when I was questioning who I was as an artist and defining who I was as a parent and a person. In order to stay accountable, I posted my daily painting on social media. This created a new web of communication and community for me during an otherwise socially and artistically isolated time. Additionally, my social media presence grew, to my amazement, from 80 followers to nearly 80,000 followers in the course of the year. Our young family was also growing, and so was the studio business. Despite the privilege of safety and support, along with an excess of resources like good food and a warm home, work we loved, life began to feel pretty heavy. 2015 was a difficult year. The global political and environmental situation, combined with the death of a grandparent and an uncle, and other loved ones in deep personal pain, was topped off by the frightening and early birth of our daughter with a month-long NICU stay at South Bend Memorial Hospital. We waffled between feelings of grief for painful experiences and overwhelming gratitude for the support that we received and the goodness that we witnessed. We wanted to nurture the gratitude while acknowledging the immense advantage that we live with as a result of our nationality, race, and sexual identity. We wanted to protect ourselves from a slippery slope of hopeless helplessness. We needed to shift our focus and regain a perspective that could again include beauty. A podcast I had listened to with Brother David Steindl-Rast kept coming up for us. Can you be grateful for everything, he asks. No, not for everything, but in every moment. He said, it's not happiness that makes us grateful, it's gratefulness that makes us happy. We decided to begin a weekly artwork collaboration based on gratitude to help us stay alert to ways that we could be thankful, and also to give new energy to a regular studio practice. I would make a weekly painting, and Justin would create a weekly piece of pottery, both inspired by gratitude, our version of a gratitude journal. The goal was to cultivate the paradox of gratefulness that clearly acknowledges difficulty and simultaneously celebrates beauty. Collaboration with each other encouraged a supportive dialogue, and it was fun to see where our gratitude thoughts overlapped, and when we surprised each other with what we saw, and when one of us needed help feeling thankful. It was a reminder to connect with each other over more than the practicalities of work and family life. And we came to recognize that if we were not intentionally choosing gratitude, by default we were choosing ingratitude. At the end of the year, my collection of 52 paintings was published in the book Tiny Gratitudes, complete with written reflections from the year. Half of the pieces that Justin made from the collection of more than 100 tableware objects were gifted along with the book to 52 different people who inspired our gratitude over the course of the year. We found after these daily and weekly creative experiments, consistent practice demonstrates commitment to a concept and draws people together in both art and peace building. The basic act of a persistent, small painting each day, over and over, has led to artistic improvement and opportunity. But more importantly, it was an exercise in trusting that when we do the next right thing, even when it's a small thing, we're on the path to wholeness. Rarely will a daily practice uncover an immediate breakthrough, major breakthrough, or yield quick results, but it's more about faith in a ritual that honors and nurtures growth. A daily routine that includes beauty connects us more fully to ourselves, and if shared, compels others to draw close in recognition of this basic desire. I believe that people were most compelled by my daily painting because it provided a moment of beauty and delight in their day, and we all long for beauty. Again, John O'Donohue says, when we experience the beautiful, there's a sense of homecoming. Some of our most wonderful memories are of beautiful places where we've felt immediately at home. We feel most alive in the presence of the beautiful, for it meets the needs of our soul.
Over the last 10 years, there's been a shift for us. We began with a focus on the hustle and production of starting our business. We're moving now into a time of more thoughtfulness and purpose. As culture makers, we want to encourage positive trends and strive to bring peace building, beauty, and intentional living to the front row. The earlier stories highlight our processes of building community through hard work and making opportunities happen through dedicated daily practice. These projects have also been woven together over the years with intentional focus on artworks dedicated to our interests in peace and social justice. We're hoping for a ripple effect, and as Christians, people of faith, and peace builders, we want to lead by example.
In our current year-long project, we're setting a weekly intention. We're identifying the challenges that come to us in our roles as partners, caregivers to our family, and global citizens. We want to connect more directly with each other and a national neighborhood on topics that construct beauty and build peace. We spend time at the beginning of each week choosing a word to focus this intention. Then we make a weekly artwork inspired by this word.
Brooke illustrates the word, following in the tradition of a fracture, or illuminated writing. I create a ceramic vessel or jug for holding liquid meant to be shared. The fracture is used to decorate or adorn the ceramic vessel, applied as a ceramic decal and carrying the emblem of the week's shared intention.
At the conclusion of the year, we plan to share the handmade vessels with our national community. We'll send them to people across the country, highlighting our process of setting an intention and encouraging shared dialogue. There are 52 jugs and drawings, one for each week of the year, and for each of the 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. These vessels are meant to be gifts that initiate a conversation about beauty, intention, and peace building. We will ask in return for personal stories in response to the chosen word on each vessel that we've gifted. We're asking recipients to engage in an intentional experience. We expect to be challenged with how this request is interpreted, and we look forward to the ways language and art can collaborate in building relationship.
We're living in a time that often feels heavy. We recognize that our personal response and contributions matter. We want to reclaim beauty and restore our intentions. Being present together is how we begin. Weaving together intentional focus, daily practice, and diverse community networks are how we continue to build a foundation for our work as artists and peace builders.
We want to end with words from author, feminist, and social justice activist L.R. Nost, who says, "Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world. All things break, and all things can be mended, not with time, as they say, but with intention. So go, love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world waits in darkness for the light that is you." Thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brooke and Justin. I know that we have overpacked this lunchtime, and I would like to invite our speakers for this plenary session to come to the table.
Steps over there. Huh. Would you like some water?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're not here for that long.
All right, everyone. It's time for our conversation about the state of the field. This is the conversation about the state of the field. Not the state of the football field, the state of the peace-building field. If the state is anything like the view, we're in good shape. If the state is anything like we've been playing, maybe not. Well, I'm Mahan Mirza, the Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, and it is my honor and privilege to chair this panel. Before we get started, let me remind you that we are live streaming all the keynote and plenary sessions, so a warm welcome to our viewers online from around the world. If you have friends and colleagues in your network who were unable to be here in person, let them know that they can join us online at croc.nd.edu. It's croc.nd.edu/building sustainable peace. We hope that while you are here at the conference, you will also consider sharing your experience and insights about this gathering online. Our communications team will be sharing photos and short video clips from the conference throughout the week on the Kroc Institute Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeds. And you can also tweet and post about the conference using the hashtag. So it's hashtag KrocCon, KrocCon19, KROCCON19. Now, to the state of the field. We are honored to have with us three very distinguished panelists and scholars. Gerard Miller is the head of the Department of Sociology, and he's the senior lecturer in Peace and Reconciliation at the University of Aberdeen. Elias Omondi Opongo is the director of the Hekima Institute of Peace Studies and International Relations, and a fellow at Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs. Father Opongo is also a proud alum of the Kroc Institute. And Lisa Schirch is a senior research fellow at the Toda Peace Institute, where she directs the Institute's social media, technology, and peace-building program. Each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions and discussion. So, over to Gerard.
So, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having us here, and thank you for this particular panel, which I think is really quite timely. Certainly it's good timing for my research. So I'm sorry also for the slide, because I did not realize that they were going to be so tiny. And you're not going to be able to read most of the words if it progresses anyway, but it's more for my timing, so don't worry about it. So very quickly, in the last year, maybe let's say 18 months now, I was funded by the Leverhulme Trust to start a project looking at the preparedness of the field of peace building to think about, theorize about, and respond to what I've been calling 21st century challenges to peace, or emerging challenges to peace. This particular interest comes from my own experience as a peace researcher, but not particularly within any peace research field. I don't do disciplinary work. I have a PhD in social science, and I've always been on the boundary then between anthropology and sociology and IR. And I publish in various different places. I did my PhD here in the States, but now I teach in Europe, where peace and conflict studies is a very different thing. And the work that I do has led me, in essence, to really be somewhat fearful about the state of the field. And that's because I'm somewhat fearful about the state of the world and our ability to prepare for and think about and respond to what the world is quite quickly becoming. So my own work has really been ethnographically focused and looking at the local experiences of different peace interventions, primarily in Sierra Leone. And my findings really started out with just failure. It didn't really, usually, these peace interventions didn't do what the people planned that they would do. So my work progressed to talking about hybridity and then friction, and now I'm writing quite a bit about complexity. And it's this complexity notion that made me think of this project. Because as I'll talk about, the future challenges are inordinately complex, right? So this project, very quickly, I interviewed 24 different leaders of big peace conflict studies organizations, academic organizations, centers, institutes, programs around the world. I did a survey of students of those programs. I did 24 interviews with staff at 6 leading international peace-building organizations. And I did 12 interviews with the heads or senior staff of 12 different local peace-building organizations in 3 regions in Nigeria to try to get an idea of how the field stands today across the academic and practitioner elements of the field, right? It's not just about the field as an academic field, nor is it just about practice. And one of the things that's very clear is that we are seeing a reemergence, and people seem conscious of this, a reemergence of old challenges, like isolationism and nationalism, the nuclear threat, concerns regarding the stability of what used to be the most stable states. The rise of China and the kind of newly aggressive emergence of Russia and various actions in Ukraine, Crimea, etc. And the, well, generally the pivot towards Asia on the US's part. And then there's also the emerging challenges, which I think have already actually emerged. And this would be things like climate change. We all seem aware of this. And the secondary results of that, and also technological innovation, things we're very concerned about, right, like AI and autonomous weaponry and drone swarms, and these very worrying kind of technologies that we hear about. And I think in the field, when I was doing these interviews, most of the people in the field seem to recognize this. Most of the people in the field are very worried about climate change. Most of the people in the field are very conscious of new technologies, and they're certainly very conscious of these reemergence of old threats. But to some extent, I think the field is very unaware, or at least not consciously addressing significant and serious concerns, like ongoing mass mobilizations, urbanization, youth bulges, particularly in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, where massive percentages of the population in various states, you know, sometimes 50, 60% of the population is under 25. The automation of labor and the potential results if manufacturing in lots of East Asian and Latin American countries, if manufacturing becomes automated, when millions of people have in essence flocked to cities in the last 30 years and given up their access to land in order to have what are already very precarious livelihoods working in factories, what happens if that all becomes automated, right? There's a great fear about how that would drive further inequality and in essence allow corporations to suck up all of the added value, right? We wouldn't even have the old basic way of redistributing wealth through salaries, right? So we in essence have and there's others, but these are kind of the 3 that are most concerning to me that I think the field is actually not addressing at all and really not talking about at all. But the real concern is that these old ones, the re-emerging ones, and the new ones like climate change that we are aware of, and the ones we're not aware of, are all interacting. They're all working together. They're all combining and multiplying their effects. And I mean this in a complexity theory way, right, with nonlinear and unpredictable or unexpected effects. Again, something that the field is only now starting to even theorize about. There's very, very few scholars within peace and conflict studies that have really worked through the implications of complexity, both for the threats that we face and for what we would do about those threats. Now, I think that there is a real worry for me. Oh, I'm not clicking the thingy. You're clicking something else?
Lisa's taking care of you.
Awesome.
Yep.
There's a real worry that the threats, in essence, are topics and themes that are not really things that peace and conflict studies or peace studies traditionally prepares people to do or to think about, right? So we have lots and lots of programs. In Europe, it's very different from the US. Britain's different from Europe. But we have lots of programs preparing people to think critically about power. And we have lots of programs, certainly in US programs, preparing people to do mediation and negotiation and collaborative problem solving, which are all helpful. But in reality, very few programs are preparing people to think about things like complexity and the interaction of these emerging challenges. We have disjunctions within the field and between the sections of the field that are really worrying, which has really come through in the data, in that traditional peace and conflict studies really doesn't talk about 21st century challenges very much, the emerging ones. We don't recognize them. I think that's one disjunction. The second is that the various disciplines that contribute to PCS, which is different in different regions and different countries, don't really talk to each other very much. And then there's the obvious divide between academics and practitioners who, again, I mean, I know that there's this narrative that we're going to be talking to each other and we're going to engage and we're going to have pracademics, but there's a massive gap. And the data, when I would talk to people for even just 20 or 30 minutes, it would emerge that really very few people are doing this. Everyone kind of thinks everyone else is doing this, and it's something they should be doing. It would be good for them and their career and their organization. But this is a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, a lot of money, no grant. And the same is true for the NGOs and the practitioner organizations. Very few people are really reaching across that divide. I think we're all aware of this. This is what's weird about this, right? We are all very conscious of these challenges, but we're unable to dislodge them, right? We can't seem to get out of this ambivalence or cynicism, or almost, when I talk to some people, almost a nihilism, right? It's just like, well, this is the situation we live in, right? Publish or perish. All I can do is publish these grant. That's I got to get these papers out, right? And I think that one of the ways around this, so this is the last necessary slide here. We're keeping it short. One of the ways around this, and I'll be presenting at this after lunch on a panel if you want to see explicit recommendations. But I think one of the ways around this is for us to actually try to be peace builders again within ourselves and for ourselves. In some ways, I think we have these ends, we have these large goals we need to overcome, these 21st century challenges to peace. And what we have to do to even have any hope of overcoming them and learning how to face them and preparing students to prepare for them, to know how to deal with them, is we have to be better at communicating with each other. We have to come up with ways to collaborate. We have to come up with negotiated positions on things. We have to respectfully listen to people on different sides of these disjunctions. All of the things that supposedly we should be doing and we should be the experts at, right? But as a field, we are not, right? And we run, I know it's good that the field is diversifying and there's more people coming into it and everyone's talking about lots of different things. But at the same time, there's no kind of shared drive and force and energy, and it could potentially get us in serious trouble. So in essence, I think we need to overcome these actually quite micro challenges, right? We as a group, as a discipline, as a field, need to figure out a way to overcome really ridiculously bureaucratic, mundane, everyday, boring challenges. The challenges of funding, the challenges of institutional expectations, the challenges of publish or perish, the challenges of disciplinary divides, really boring stuff. But if we don't work together and figure out a way as a field to overcome this really boring stuff, the really exciting stuff, and I mean this pejoratively, you know, climate change, the really kind of big stuff, we're not going to be prepared to face it, right?
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. A lot to think about. Elias.
Thank you very much, and especially for this particular panel. When I was first asked to look at the state of the field with particular reference to the African continent and with the diverse issues that the continent is experiencing, is obviously a bigger task than we can do in 10 minutes. But I'll just give you a little bit of a background in terms of, I don't know, I can have the next slide. Okay. Have I just? Thank you. A little bit of a background. Peace studies as such is a very new field in the continent, maybe just last 20 or 25 years. But as a practice, obviously, this is very much embedded, like in any society, on our own cultural practices, our own institutional, and also political heritage. In the post-colonial period, those who were really at the forefront, and I saw there was a panel that was discussing literature and peace building, were the people in literature, writing novels, the Chinua Achebes, the Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Maria Mabaa, and others, were really making a critique of the new African democracy and African society. And it's that critique that really brought a kind of a a new thinking on the kind of society that we want in the post-conflict, in the post-colonial period. We also had political scientists that moved in very strongly to talk about democracy and inclusion as an important element for the new states of the continent. But then we moved to the periods of 1980s. The post-colonial was much more in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1980s, the major concerns were around the socioeconomic concerns. And the political economists came in very strongly as the leaders in peace studies or in engaging around the issues of governance and economics, and particularly because of the structural adjustment program that was sweeping around the continent and also in Latin American countries. Fast forward to the 90s, we had the multipartyism moving in from single-party states to much more inclusive systems of governance. And here we saw the civil society emerge very, very strongly as a voice advocating for human rights. And along that were the political scientists also came in very strongly, and there was a call for religious freedom and democratic freedom. Religious leaders also emerged here as important actors in not only bringing the various countries together, but we saw, for example, in the French-speaking Africa, where religious leaders chaired the various national conferences on dialogue around political and social justice issues. And with these two, civil society and religious leaders emerging in this field of peace studies, I'll talk in my next slide on how they've really shaped the conversation around peace studies today. In the 2000s, there's been a little bit of a shift towards constitutionalism, accountable governance, respect the term of office, have stronger institutions that are also inclusive. And this, to some extent, has been living in tension with the kind of democracy that, in the continent we've been asking ourselves what works and what doesn't work. Alongside that, then, the particular distinction that we make here is on these three actors, on the side, thank you. On these three actors, the academicians, this being a very interdisciplinary field, we're seeing sociologists coming in and political scientists and also people now in peace studies coming in very, very strongly. But the civil society and the academicians have been able to shape the conversations around peace studies. And it's actually sometimes the civil society is a little bit ahead of the game in terms of highlighting the key issues that are both local and global. And in that sense, that the interdisciplinarity between the practice and the theory that my colleague just talked about is very, very important in any kind of peace studies within the African continent. But then the challenge for the civil society over the last 10 years or so, the whole issue of cooptation and disempowerment, given that they so much rely on the external donor funding. But at the same time, what we've seen from the 90s getting into the 2000s is that a number of civil society individuals and organizations as well that had been very critical of the government. And the moment there is a new dispensation and people feel now we've really achieved what we've been fighting for, some of these have been co-opted into the government. And that has weakened the civil society. And the third effect has been the fact that the constitutionalism or the cry for a new constitution, which goes in tandem with very strong political leadership in a number of countries like Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Congo, has shrunk the civil society space. So within the peace studies, this is a very important aspect that we are currently looking at on how this civil society space that has shrunk, what are the alternative engagement spaces that we are left with? And lastly, the religious institutions. emerging strongly in the 90s and also in the 2000s, but coming in very forcefully at two levels that I'll discuss in my last slide here. So here, what we've noted is that the three categories within the peace studies field. And the first one is governance, democratic change, and civic engagement. Governance, I've already talked about the constitutionalism, but within the civic engagement, there's a phenomenon that has happened in the last 5 to 8 years, and that is the non-violence, political non-violence engagement. In some contexts that we least expected, this would be happening. The most recent has been Sudan, very autocratic government. Bashir had been in power for close to 30 years, and nobody would ever have thought of coming out on the streets and protesting against a very strong military government. And if you ever watch the clips, they're all over on CNN and also on Al Jazeera and other international media, you'll notice that the discipline and the engagement and the level of articulation by the civil society groups, academic as well as religious group, was very, very strong, and really to the high standards of non-violence. We also saw that in Burkina Faso, where young people came forward and said, we don't want you in power, even though you've been there for more than 26 years. And they spent days and days, and every day after every demonstration that they had, the next day was a cleanup. And they'll make sure that they leave this place as it is until the president had to leave power. And the third, of course, Egypt, which is a kind of a mixed bag, but still demonstrated the strength of the non-violence. I'm saying this because in the 90s, the civil society and the kind of peace-building approach that they had taken was much more confrontational. And so we are seeing a kind of a marriage here between the non-violence and direct civic engagement. A lot of writings now in the continent, because of their constitutionalism, is also looking at what are the alternatives to the systems of governance. Is democracy what Africa needs today? People are much more concerned with two things: inclusion and socioeconomic reforms. With a continent that has more than 50% of its population below the age of 20, it's really a major concern. Rwanda is celebrating or commemorating 25 years since the genocide. More than 60% of Rwanda's population has never known genocide. This happened in 1994. And so you have more than half the population that has never known genocide. So the discourse there is very different. Secondly, the post-conflict peace-building review. What is working, what is not working. The transitional justice mechanisms that really picked up in the mid-90s from the experience of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is currently under review. The models that have been used, the tension between the international systems of justice through the ICC, International Criminal Court, and the localized mechanisms of justice and the traditional or the cultural institution, there's a major tension there. I remember 2 years ago when the case of Vincent began in The Hague. One of the things that the civil society did was to put these big screens all over the villages to show that, you know, the ICC case is beginning and the Lord's Resistance Army, one of their leaders, is being tried. But the contrast for the people was just too much to bear. Here he was, very well dressed in the Netherlands, in a suit and a tie. This was a man who was in rastas and very rugged with his gun. And then he's also, because of the translation, he had these earphones and said, this guy is listening to music. You know, he's really having good time, and you're telling us that now he's being brought before a court of justice? And you see that kind of tension and disconnection between the international systems of justice and localized mechanism is another issue that we are looking at in the post-conflict reconstruction. And the state fragility and proliferation of small arms. We did a study in 9 countries looking at 3 studies on small arms state fragility, using a conceptual framework of authority, capacity, and legitimacy of the states as a measuring point to see how this state fragility is impacting very strongly on the weak states. And one of the things we don't question is the source of these arms. Africa is home to more than close to 200 million arms that are scattered all over the countries within the continent. Ethiopia alone has close to 700,000 AK-47 that have been buried somewhere between communities and between militias and nomadic groups. Lastly, religion and conflict and peace. Faith-based diplomacy, and this study, Dan Philpott and others have also been looking into this, but we are really interested to look at the new role of faith-based diplomacy. A number of institutions, and Peter John is here, are looking at the parliamentary liaison offices. How do you engage legislators and bring back to them the levels of knowledge and engagement and advocacy that is important for the lawmakers? And also the instrumentalization of religion. We've seen that now with the wave of terrorism, even in countries like Burkina Faso, where we never saw this just in the last 2 years, in Nigeria with Boko Haram, and also in northern Kenya with the Al-Shabaab. In a lot of these situations, religion has been instrumentalized, but at the same time, it has brought in a forward call to the religious leaders to engage much more strongly. So just to conclude, I would say that the peace studies is really at the turning point, and there's a lot of expectation in terms of review of systems of governance, of the peace practice, and also of engagement of religious and civil society institutions in peace building. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lisa.
I think this is not working, so...
Yes, it's not working.
This isn't working, so if you can, I'll just put my hand up when I want it to go. So I've spent the last 20 years of my career in the field of peace building being a peace building evangelist to the US military, which means I have gone and I have done training and conflict resolution and civil society conflict prevention at West Point, at Quantico Marine Center, the Pentagon, and I've learned many things from the military that were surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that I would learn, as well as go and try to convert some people to our way of thinking. One of the things I've learned is that they do very accurate self-reflection. They're very hard on themselves. And I heard a lecture once on the 10 things they did wrong in Iraq. And at the end of the lecture, they said, I really wish we would have listened to some of those voices in 2003 that told us this wasn't going to go very well. Which was not at all satisfying to hear, of course, because of so much tragedy that's happened there. But the other thing that they do in the military is they're looking 10 to 20 years ahead. And their big thing is we're always fighting this war based on the last war instead of really looking ahead. So they've done much more thinking about the future and what is happening and what are the trends. So my presentation is going to have 8 points that are a little bit critical of our community and also looking forward. The first point, as you can see, is that I think we now need to decenter peace building. From the 1980s onward, the Hewlett Foundation and several big donors gave a lot of money to start university-based programs in peace building. And this was a tremendous gift to our field. It created graduates, and those graduates have gone on and set up new institutions all over the world. And it's really institutionalized the field of peace building. But what we forget is that those original graduate programs formed because there was already peace building happening on the ground. And the expertise and the case studies and the rituals and the documentation of what was working was already there in the 1980s. This field was founded by civil society out in communities around the world. And now there's this illusion or myth, I think, that peace building came from the United Nations, when in reality it's the graduates from all of these programs that now populate the United Nations peace building offices. They're many of our former students. So peace building is not trickling down from the United Nations. It has bubbled up, and now it has colonized United Nations thinking, which is a good thing. But the myth that somehow we can think of local civil society as our implementing partners, or that we need to promote local ownership as if there's not already local capacity. This myth is deeply entrenched. Whenever I go to any of the Western capitals, in London, in Brussels, there is this notion that there is a lack of local capacity. And when they talk about civil society, they almost always talk about implementing partners, as if all the good ideas are developed in Western capitals and out there implemented by people doing what white folks want them to do. And I think this is a very dangerous idea for our field, and something that we all need to participate in overcoming this myth that peace building has always been local, and the expertise and the innovation continues to come from out in the Philippines, where civil society is sitting with the military, and they have security clearance to counsel the military in how to engage with armed groups so that they can prevent armed attacks, and they can do a very different peace-building approach to terror and to kidnappings. So that's the first point, that we need to think about decentering peace building and remembering that local ownership is not a new idea. It doesn't trickle down. It's actually coming from the ground up. Second point, climate change is actually going to force us to recognize this, because the projections on climate change, and again, okay, half of the country doesn't believe it's happening here in the United States, but at the US military, everybody believes climate change is happening, and they are having conferences and seminars, and they're planning out, and they're saying all of the wars of the future are going to be about water and drought and major storms and states collapsing. So the state system is actually a relatively new creation. We forget that. And it very well could fall apart in the face of climate change, because the number of storms and the rising sea waters that are going to flood 35 million people's homes in Bangladesh and many other countries. We are not at all prepared for what is coming. And this is where I feel like our community sometimes is not on the ball. We might be talking about climate change and conflict, but we're not actually thinking about what's going to happen is that local governments are going to need to respond to tremendous institutional breakdown, and they are going to be the front line of humanitarian work. And all the kinds of conflict transformation that will need to happen when masses of migrants from countries that are flooded move somewhere else. So, of course, the whole history of humanity is one of migration. We've all walked all over the planet. And each of our genes in our cells has that memory. We've always moved, but that idea of migration is now, as we know, at the heart of polarization in this country. And I'm going to go to the next slide, number 3. We already have a polarization issue. And of course, our field of peace building works at social cohesion and trying to figure out how we bridge these divides. Suddenly, our field, even though they're not talking about peace building in the New York Times and Washington Post, they are actually talking about what we have been studying and doing. And it concerns me that actually there's often not a narrative about peace building when we start talking from a political science point of view about polarization. And I especially face this when I go out to Silicon Valley, where it's as if I'm flying into a foreign country and no one's ever heard of conflict resolution or peace building. They have no idea this is a field. They have no idea the UN and the World Bank all have major million-dollar programs on this. And it's a little scary how California, including Hollywood, doesn't tell our stories, doesn't use our language, and doesn't know any of us or our books. So it's scary because now technology and social media is at the front lines of furthering polarization. And there's a session tomorrow just looking at technology and polarization, which is my full-time work now, is trying to figure out, do we need government regulation, Facebook to change, or does civil society need to do what we always have done and form brigades of civilians working online to put out different messages? The next point, number 4, is the increasing synergy of people power plus peace building. A lot of us began our careers in peace building actually as activists. I know I was out in front of the Pentagon as a college student with my little sign, and then I got my PhD, and then I met inside the Pentagon and said the same things. And so there's this kind of been this institutionalizing in our field for those of us who started out as activists, that we moved inside to the doors and to the conversations. But we've missed something in kind of moving on, because there's something about protest and mass public action that is absolutely essential, and it's part of humanity. I think the yellow umbrellas in Hong Kong just shows this is a society where they have tried to educate people about democracy, not spread these ideas, and young people there are demanding it and coming to it on their own, that they want a different kind of society. I see Veronique Desdois is here, and Maria Stefan, I believe, is also, and they are putting a lot of time into thinking about how do we bring together peace building and nonviolent action. Next slide. Using narratives and neuroscience to spark transformation. At Stanford University, there was this tiny little department called Computers as Persuasive Technology. And actually the director of that, B.J. Fogg, had peace in mind and thought we could create world peace with computers and persuasive technology. But the understanding of neuroscience by the people designing Facebook and Twitter and these algorithms that run on YouTube is scary, because it really is about how our brains work and what we want to see, and this affirmation addiction of seeing those like buttons on Facebook. And what Facebook knows is that when we get to the bottom of our brainstem, the part of our brain that loves story, that loves emotion, that loves to be engaged, that's what technology is triggering. And it's the stories often of outrage and anger and hate that is motivating so much of the negative stuff that's happening on technology. Our field needs to catch up with the neuroscience and actually kind of not counter our tendency to want to evaluate and prove that peace building can work, but kind of keep that in check with the fact that ultimately our brains want stories, they don't want facts. And we can give all the facts in the world about how peace building works, but what's going to be most effective is telling a very good story. Next. Number 6, innovating peace engineering. I see the new dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason is an engineer. And this summer in The Hague, I met with the first peace engineering seminar, and there were 6 deans of engineering schools that all want to start peace engineering programs. And I was so perplexed. And they're completely sold. They are coming from an ethical basis that they know you can design buildings and cities and communities and computer programs with the goal of peace and social cohesion. And they have great ideas and examples of how they've already done it. I feel like, wow, they're thinking outside of the box. Sometimes I think we have just talked to ourselves for far too long. And really these other fields, this integration and the cross-fertilization is what's necessary. Next slide. Wow. This is the last slide. Margaret Wheatley talks about islands of sanity. And I reread her work on this over and over, because so many of the dreams of my youth when I started in peace building 30 years ago are crashing. The idea of the world and building this better world, it's tragic. It's not coming about. We're having less democracy, less human rights. There's more authoritarianism. And it's kind of a time in the world where it's hard to see what we've done with our lives for 30 years, those of us who've been investing in this. But to think at this dangerous time in history about protecting the values, even as we have all these institutions creating technocrats, how to build peace, how to create a log frame, how to do evaluation, great. but let's not forget that it's going to be the ethicists, the values that we are actually trying to protect, and that religious leaders and ritual leaders and artists and many others are actually more central, perhaps, in creating that ethical framework that we need to protect to make these islands of sanity. Thank you.
Thank you for these three very rich and very different complementary presentations. We have about 15 minutes to engage in conversation, questions, and discussion. We have microphones at the end of the room. There will be someone hopefully coming around with the microphone. If you have raised your hand, you need to speak in the microphone for everybody else, but also for our live stream audience. And while that is getting set up, I'd like to invite the panelists, if you would like to comment on one of the others' presentations, now's the time. Or ask each other a question.
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask Lisa a question, because I was just reminding Lisa that, you know, we go back to 17 years ago when I was taking a summer course at Eastern Mennonite, and she had just come out of her PhD program, and I sat in her class at that time. So, and it was on active nonviolence. And I'd like to, if you can relate this to your engagement with the military. Military says that they've made mistakes the way in which Iraq has gone, and it's really embarrassing. I was in Boston at the time, just after September 11th, and demonstrations demonstrated that there was a new way of thinking, that people are saying that militarized approach to peace won't work, and it hasn't worked. And we are now going back to the table into dialogue with the Taliban and other groups. Are they embracing nonviolence at all? Are they reconsidering dialogue at all?
I think what I learned from my time working in Congress and with the Pentagon is that I wouldn't say they believe in nonviolence or peace building, but they know that war doesn't work. And so they are more open to hearing other ideas at this point. And I have heard so many four-star generals say there's no military solution in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Pakistan. And so there is a recognition of the failure of war. They are creating and trying to think of the alternatives. But I do know that a few years ago, when the Trump administration was very eager to go to war with Iran, it was the military leaders saying, this is a terrible idea and it's not going to work. And because I'd heard that conference on all the failures in Iraq, I felt like, you know, they are the much better leaders at this point. I trust the military more than I trust Congress to not fantasize about firepower solutions, because it really is a fantasy. And Hollywood actually has created that story that it works, and the military leaders know it doesn't work.
Mahan. Well, here's a question from the floor.
Do I stand up?
Yes, please stand up.
I prefer to sit.
Quickly introduce yourself. And then
thank you very, very much to all three of you, all four of you. But I just wanted to pick up, Elias spoke about the question about alternatives to democracy, but I felt democracy didn't really come into all of the other discussions. And I feel it's about democracy has been subverted or has been grasped and is being used as a tool for getting power rather than for what democracy is really about. So whether it's alternative democracy or refining democracy, I would like the panel to comment more about that.
Take a couple of questions.
Sure. Maybe. We might take a couple of questions and then one more up here.
Where?
Right here in the front.
They can say their names.
And please say your name as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Emil Secuda. I am from Argentina. Thank you for your presentation. And my question is a provocative question, and is how we can distinguish when the people is in the street, for example, in my continent, in Latin America, if that people is claiming for justice peace or for more conservative democratic model, because that happens usually in our continent. Thank you.
Okay, should we do one more? Yes. I'm going to ask you to keep track of your questions.
Yeah, my name's Neil Cooper. I'm from Kent State University. I guess one of my questions is one of the things that we're seeing today, certainly in the US and Europe, is the emergence of a strong bring the troops back home sentiment, and arguably to some extent that's kind of merges into a form of anti-war sentiment. But none of that kind of goes through peace studies, right? It's located in an isolationist urge. It goes hand in hand with, massive increases in U.S. defense expenditure, global military expenditure, global arms trade. So, is there something there that the peace studies community can capture, can build on?
Okay, I think we should respond.
I'll just answer the first one because I want to point out Veronique Dedoué is doing this typology of different types of protests, and I think the question is very good. Yes, there are different protests with different goals, and not all protest is generically good. And I think that's kind of the issue here in this country too. In Charlottesville, then we had a bunch of young white men have a protest, and they were saying very hateful things to other people, and they want a very different white supremacist society than the rest of us want. So I would not think that all protests are good.
Elias, did you want to take that?
Just to pull it through with Emil's question and also one on the democracy, I think key things for people coming out on the street more and more is inclusion and the address to marginalization and groups that are being left out from really being part and parcel of that particular society. So it doesn't matter really how that kind of democratic society is defined or redefined, but major concerns are really emerging strongly on issues around inclusion and marginalization from whichever kind of sector you're looking at. And that, again, to point out my earlier point on the youth bulge, which is really not sufficiently being addressed. And the kind of economic systems that we continue to propagate, and China now is at the forefront of that big capitalism approach, is that more and more, and it's across continents, we are leaving majority of the populations behind. And this is going to have major repercussions on the kind of governance systems that we have, and even on stability of societies. And it's already happening in France, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to answer both of those questions as well. The issue of democracy and the kind of ongoing search for alternatives, for the reasons that Elias points out, that I think are very accurate. And it's not just in Africa, it's not just the youth bulge, it's, in Eastern Europe and even in the West. People have not been experiencing democracy, which in the West has been tied with capitalism and expropriation to some extent, and has become horrendously unequal in the past 40 years. And these two things are conjoined at the hip. And so I think that the ongoing search for an alternative, which you can see, obviously China is filling this vacuum for a lot of people through the Belt and Road Initiative to a lot of different countries. And I think Elias again pointed out earlier that to a lot of people, democracy has not provided socioeconomic benefits, and so, well, what alternative is? And that was always the claim of democracy and capitalism, right? That you'd liberalize, and then there would be more for everybody to share, and then we'd all share, and then society would be better. And we didn't share. And so this is where we have now this rise, obviously, in nationalism and isolationism, and I don't know if there's something there for peace studies to capture, which is the term Neil used, but I think that's exactly what peace studies is here for, is to address those kinds of challenges in our society. So, peace studies in the UK tends to be an IR-driven thing, but peace studies in the States was always rooted in racial issues and class issues and sociological, psychosocial dynamics, where peace building, as in intergroup peace building, was the root of much of it, right? So I think that whether or not there's something there to capture or not, it's certainly this drive towards nationalism and isolationism and the associated kind of fear or hatred of immigrants and worries about losing culture. These are exactly the kinds of issues that we need to kind of reach back into peace studies and conflict resolution and mediation and alternative dispute resolution, collaborative problem solving. We need to reach back into those toolkits and start doing these things. And we haven't, right? But that, in essence, is an opportunity, I guess, for us, but it's an opportunity born of a massive failure, which is, of course, what we've done in the last 40 years.
Further questions? Yes, we have two hands here.
He wanted to go first. I'll go first. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Liz Bernstein from the Nobel Women's Initiative, and here with colleagues from the Korea Peace Now campaign. And it's a women-led peace campaign, and I'm struck at the state of the field. Women's movements and feminist peace movements and equality hasn't come up from any of you, because what we see, even in Sudan, really a lot of the movement was led by women and generations of women. So I'm just wondering if any of you could comment on where you're seeing gender equality and women-led peace movements fitting in.
I'm Bob Johansen, Kroc Institute. It seems to me that the most basic and fundamental reason that we're in the troubles we are is because we have not yet learned how to identify across boundaries, whether they're national, racial, religious, class, gender. And I'm just wondering if we don't need to spend more time focusing on how to build identities that cross boundaries, whether it's within a country or between countries. It seems to me if we would do that and be successful at that, we would have solved many of our other problems. A part of it may be related also to the last question. But now we did hear about catching up on neuroscience. Is that addressing this issue of overcoming our boundaries and learning how to identify really with all human beings and possibly even with all of creation? Or where do you see this identity building need for knowledge and practice in the peace studies future?
Okay.
I've talked a lot, but I'll answer because I feel very passionately, obviously, about women's movements and in terms of people power, the profound roles that women are playing as leadership. Also as religious actors, often it's women religious actors in unofficial roles who are doing, I think, the majority. So I would have many things to say. Just because it didn't make my list of 8 doesn't mean it's not really important. And I think that identity is also very important. There's this new book I edited on violent extremism, which looks at a peace-building approach to violent extremism, which I think has very much to do with identity. And again, why I think our field is actually so relevant now with all this conversation about extremist groups and hate speech online. And much of the left progressive wing has, I think, a very hateful and aggressive and resistance mindset, which is completely understandable, but I think it's not really a strategy for how we're going to be engaging with the right wing. And I live in very rural Virginia where all my neighbors have Confederate flags pointing at my house. My husband's Jewish, so it feels like a threat. And many of them won't talk to us, but I know, even though they're hateful and even though they might not like us, the only chance I have of safety is walking my dogs and saying hello to them and trying to relate as a human being, as a woman, as a person, and trying to like negotiate these identities that we can live as neighbors and we can believe different things. I can have the only Democrat sign where everybody else has the Trump sign on my road. So I think actually that identity work is at the very front line still of our peace building strategy of relationships and negotiating how despite our many differences, are we going to find common ground and negotiate a way forward where their identity doesn't have to threaten mine or ours?
Also, just to respond, yes, when I talked about inclusion, exclusion, this to respond to Liz on women. Last night I was having a discussion with one of the participants that we really need to do a study on the role that women played in Sudan nonviolence. And if you saw, those images were really beautiful. Women who came forward, and Sudan not being known to be that progressive when it came to liberal rights of women. They'll be there with their children. People come to cook for the demonstrators, and it was just, it was a carnival. And we need to learn from those experiences. Next year, we are celebrating 20 years of UNSCR 1325 on women, peace, and security. And I think is something we need to recognize. In Nairobi at Hekima College, you'll be having that international conference in October. But just again to appreciate that particular role. Professor Johansson's question on identities and negotiating identities and new identities. This, in my view, we are now linking it as well to the kind of democratic societies that we want to build. Rwanda says, because of the genocide, there's no Hutu, there's no Tutsi. You know. Burundi says, we have Hutus, we have Tutsis. Every position in government will be shared 40% for the Tutsi and 60% for the Hutus. What identities define a modern society or emerging democracies? Party lines, ethnic, religious, or simply political? And I think it's a very important case that you are raising. And I really don't have a solution to it, but I think for new democracies and the way those identities have become so fluid, we need to relook. And for most African societies, those identities have been politicized. So that your ethnic identity is politicized and your political identity is also ethnicized. And that has created a lot of tension in many societies. Thank you.
I know we're, I think, out of time almost, but I wanted to answer Bob's question and then go backwards in a way. I do think that I think both the other panelists are right, and identity has to be core to everything. But at the same time, you know, we've seen technology be a tool and a driver of making schisms in society. And I think the economy has been exactly the same thing for the last 35 or 40 years. And we see the same thing driven by various policies or narratives regarding immigration or race or gender. And so identity, of course, is never isolated from all of these other political and economic dynamics, and we have and technological dynamics, and unfortunately we have kind of let a lot of things slip that are now leading to these challenges of identity and whether or not we can see ourselves in other people and other groups. And the fear, the really great fear, I mean, you started your conversation, really, we should be terrified. We're not terrified enough, right? The fear is, in essence, it's taken 40 years to get things the way they are. We don't have 40 years to put things back. If we don't all get on board and realize that we're all on, you know, spaceship Earth in the next 11 years now, last year it was 12, now it's 11, we're kind of sunk, literally and figuratively. We just have to get it done. But I do worry that, you know, I'm the father of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I just think we left it too late. And I worry that we don't have 40 years to get the ship turned around. But the identity thing has to be key, and this is why I would call for peace studies as a field, peace and conflict studies, whatever it is, to get together and stop having this kind of the international focus and the domestic focus and the identity focus and the gender focus and the race focus. Yes, all of these things are important. None of these things are priorities. If they're not all sorted, none of it will be sorted. Or at least, if we're not working towards solving these things, then we're not working towards solving any of them.
Well, on that hopeful note, we'll bring this session to a close. Are there any announcements before we move on? Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking this panel.